Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Reviews. In this series, I look at usually fairly new books that have to do with applying philosophy to life, self-help, leadership, all of those things that have to do with practical rationality and advice about how we ought to live. Today, I am reviewing How to Be a Friend, and if that sounds intriguing, it's actually titled in different ways because this is really a new edition of an old book by Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, which is generally called the On Friendship, or sometimes called the Laelius because of the main character. In Latin, it's the De Amicitia. And Princeton University Press has been putting out these editions of new translations. This one is by Philip Freeman. So you can see here, they're very nicely made. We'll talk about all the good things about it in just a moment. And so this is essentially an older book that has been republished and retranslated with a new introduction by an ancient scholar. So that's what you've got here. I can actually unqualifiedly recommend the book, other than, you should consider whether you want to shell out the $16.95 for it, but it is quite good, and it's an excellent translation. It's definitely a book that you want to read, Cicero's On Friendship. So, we'll talk about the ins and outs of it now a little bit more in detail, and that'll help you decide whether you want to get this particular edition or whether you want to go with another one. The first things that we look at are the style, the structure, and a summary of the work. So style in this case is going to refer not just to the style in English, but also to Cicero himself. Cicero is a tough person to read and to translate in the Latin, I can tell you from experience. And this is a great translation. This is, very accessible and readable. Some of the older translations can be, a little bit more tricky at times. And it's got a nice introduction here that's also quite readable. The introduction is pretty short, just a matter of less than 10 pages, but it's quite good. And the structure of the work is pretty straightforward. There's the introduction, and that's really the only other main thing, other than the further reading and the notes in the back. The rest of it is all text. And Cicero's work, De Amicitia, is a dialogue, more or less. I mean, some dialogues are very dialogical. Other dialogues are more of the sort where you have a main speaker and other people are breaking in every once in a while, and there's sort of a dramatic setting to it. And that's the kind of dialogue that this is, the kind of dialogue that Cicero typically writes. But it is, if not intensely dialogical, it's certainly dialectical, meaning that they're working through a number of different important topics and considering common and elite points of views on those topics, some of which are to be endorsed as correct, and he'll give arguments why, some of which are going to be rejected as mistaken. And he'll not only give arguments why they should be rejected, but also delve a little bit into the mindsets of the people who are endorsing or advocating the wrong-headed positions. And the entire dialogue does center on friendship, amicitia, something that was incredibly important for the ancient Greeks and equally important for the ancient Romans, who are also drawing upon Greek wisdom and Romanizing it or Latinizing it, if you like, and Cicero played a major role in that. So the entire work centers around that, and it keeps coming back to key ideas. Another thing that's important to know about the style is that there are, quite a few references to ancient examples, meaning people who existed in reality, for example, Scipio, who gets mentioned in this as a great person and a great friend as well. Then there's also some legendary people, and so a lot of that is coming from ancient Greece and Rome, and so you might not be all that conversant with it. But fortunately, it's pretty extensively footnoted, so they'll help you out with that. They can give you enough information. If you want to know more, you can figure out where to go. The other thing to say about the structure is in this series, much like the Loeb editions, there is English on one side and the other language, in this case Latin, on the other side. We call this facing pages, and so if you want to be able to see what Cicero himself actually said, you can go from the translation to the Latin, which is very nice if you know the Latin. If you don't, it's not quite so helpful, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's kind of nice. It's like the Loeb editions, with the exception that there is no scholarly or critical apparatus here the way there is in the Harvard Loeb editions. But that's quite all right, because you don't need that most of the time. The summary of it. So what you've got here is, like I said, a dialogue. And it's focused on the topic of friendship, and it's going to consider, the nature of the phenomenon of friendship and why it's important and who are good friends and all sorts of other related topics. And they're going to move from point to point to point in a fairly systematic way, although there are a few places where Cicero himself has his character Tullius say, "Oh, I made a digression here. Let's come back to the main point." So that's what's going on in this, and the summary, quite simply could be put: friendship is really important. Here's how to properly understand it. This might be helpful for you in dealing with the vicissitudes of friendship and other relationships and things that we think are friendships and actually aren't, as you live out your life in the 21st century with using advice coming from somebody from, essentially 2 millennia ago. So that's the style, the structure, and the summary of this work. In his introduction, Philip Freeman actually provides a listing of some of what he takes to be the best bits of timeless advice on friendship, which he says How to Be a Friend is filled with. And that's the bulk of the introduction. So I'm just going to hit on some of these key points and maybe add a few things in here, and that's really a decent summary of the work. So number 1 point, there are different kinds of friendships. That's kind of a commonplace in literature on friendship. The How to Be a Friend or on Friendship, De Amicitia, is pretty dependent on Aristotle's analysis in the Nicomachean and Eudemian ethics, which had become kind of a commonplace by the time of Cicero. Many other authors had picked that up, so of course that's a natural launching point. How to distinguish between different kinds of relationships that we call friendship, that's a really important thing to be able to do, because some friendships are friendship in the truest sense, and others are, you might say, further away from the model. A second point, only good people can be true friends. This doesn't mean that you can't be friendly with anybody who's not a good person, or if you're not a good person. But it does mean that if you want to enjoy the most lasting, the deepest, the closest to the core kind of friendship, you actually do have to be a good person. And, it's interesting. Cicero, I'll mention, when he's talking about goodness, he uses the term virtue. And he says that we don't want to set the bar for virtue so high that almost nobody can meet it. So we want to think about the kind of virtue that people that we've actually experienced have been able to show us, and that we might ourselves develop towards. So good is an important term here, but we have to contextualize it. Number 3, we should choose our friends with care. This is a point that's made at a number of different places in the work. Why should we choose our friends with care? Because we spend time with them, we're influenced by them, and they can put us into situations that we might not welcome if they're the wrong sorts of people. Number 4, friends make you a better person. Okay, again, understanding this to be good friends, not bad friends who exercise a bad influence on you, but good friends will, in fact, bring out, as we say, the best in you and try to hold you accountable for your own actions and choices and character. Here's another nice one. Make new friends, but keep the old. Cicero has a whole discussion in here about why it's important to retain old friendships and not, sort of take them for granted while you jump to a new, perhaps more exciting friendship. Why you need to actually try to hold on to all of your friendships, but be open to, new relationships as well. The 6th one, friends are honest with each other. Friends will, as I mentioned, hold you accountable. They'll tell you what you need to hear rather than just what you want to hear, so that's kind of important as well. Many things that we would call friendships aren't truly friendships because they don't behave in a friendly way. Number 7, the reward of friendship is friendship itself. Friendship is, you might say, something intrinsically valuable. And this is something that, we sometimes lose sight of in the present, but was acknowledged by the ancients. And they thought that really solid, genuine friendships were kind of hard to come by, but incredibly desirable. And, many people lived out their lives within that sort of framework. So, quite important. This is another very important one. Number 8, a friend never asks another friend to do something wrong. This is a constant tension within friendships and within the vast literature on friendship. What do you do when your friend comes to you and says, I killed somebody, let's hide the body, right? Or anything else. Doesn't have to be quite so dramatic as that. What do you do when a friend suggests to you that you should turn a cold shoulder to somebody who doesn't deserve that, right? Cicero thinks that a genuine friendship is not going to demand that of people. You may be asked to do difficult things that you don't want to do, but they shouldn't be wrong things. You shouldn't be asked to do things that are difficult for you because they're actually wrong and they violate your conscience. Another key idea, friendships can change over time. We make a lot of friendships at certain life stages, and then we need to, see whether they remain friendships or whether they cool off and break down, even, sort of just get forgotten. They require some maintenance, and that also requires that the people grow into new ways of looking at things. Finally, number 10, without friends, life is not worth living. That's, a rather dramatic way of putting it, but it's saying that friendship is actually at the core of what is good in life. What else do we need to talk about? One of the other topics that is addressed is it possible to actually define friendship? And Cicero provides, a rough and ready definition in saying that friendship is nothing other than agreement with goodwill, benevolentia, and affection, caritate, between people about all things divine and human, right? So that provides us with a sort of structure and criterion for saying what genuine friendship is. There's also some great discussions in there about what the basis of friendship is. Is friendship based ultimately on opposites attracting, as we say, or as was common in ancient times, you have a friend you want to be with and desire because they supply something that you lack and you supply something that they lack? Or is friendship based on something else? Cicero actually does think that the best kind of friendship is based on a recognition of the moral character of the other person. So, there could be a bit of admiration there where you're like, wow, that person is really courageous or really generous. I wish I could be like that. But that's not quite the same thing as need or desire in that sense, where you're like, well, I want to be friends with that person because they have the best parties, and I really like partying, man, and I don't have the resources to do that. That's a different kind of thing. So making that distinction is quite important. A lot of discussion in there about how friendships break down and why, and what sort of problems to look out for. And there's a beautiful passage about halfway through the work, where he talks about virtues. Here it is. I'm going to actually read this to you. The men who claim that virtue is something hard and rigid like iron are not worth listening to. Truly, in many aspects of life, but especially in friendship, virtue can bend and yield so that it shapes itself to the needs of a friend, in both good times and bad. That's kind of an interesting notion to play around with, that friendship and perhaps other relationships as well help us to be more flexible in how we're applying virtue or moral goodness or rightness. And then finally, I'll mention one other really kind of cool key point and passage. There's this discussion about the 3 boundary stones, right? He says, consider with me the limits and boundary stones of friendship. I'm aware of 3 opinions on the subject, none of which I agree with. First, that we should care about our friends in the same way we care about ourselves. Second, that our goodwill towards our friends should be exactly equal to their goodwill towards us. Third, that whatever value a man puts on himself, his friends should do the same. And, the first one is fairly widespread as a belief, and so are the others, and it gets brought up a lot. And Cicero gives you some reasons why he doesn't buy into any of these 3. The other thing that I'll mention as an important key point as well that didn't get brought up in that summary is something that also comes up in earlier discussions of friendship. For example, I mentioned in Aristotle, friendship has an equalizing function, so that it takes the person who's better off in certain respects and allows them to be on the same level as the person who isn't as well off. And that's kind of a interesting feature of it. Aristotle actually thought this is quite important, and I think Cicero sees that as very important as well. We don't have to be exactly the same or of superlative virtue or anything like that in order to be friends with each other. And friendship provides us with a framework in which we can become better people. So those are some of the key ideas of the work. Hopefully those were, tantalizing enough to you that you'd want to go and read this text. This section on what I found good in the work is admittedly a little bit short, but you shouldn't infer from it that there isn't that much good that I found in the work. It's rather that this is already a great work, and this edition of it is good because it's working off of that. It's sort of like having a symphony performance, and you pick the best music, and now you've also got, a great orchestra and a great conductor, and we say, oh, wow, what a wonderful performance. But it's really Prokofiev who's doing the heavy lifting, right? Or Rachmaninoff or whoever. And it's really Cicero who's doing the heavy lifting in this. The book looks nice. It's quite attractive in layout and all of that. But, of course, it wouldn't be good if it wasn't Cicero himself and his own, genius and diligence that produced this. So Cicero is always worth reading. I think that Cicero is a highly underrated Hellenistic philosopher who anybody who wants to know anything about ancient philosophy really does need to read. And this one I think is thought-provoking enough that even if you're not that interested in ancient philosophy or philosophy as such, you probably do want to read this because it gives you a lot of, if not necessarily great advice that you're going to take immediately to heart, it at least raises some very important issues about friendship and relationship that I think you would want to consider if you want to be living an intentional life, if you want to be developing, if you want to, think about the structure and direction of your relationships. So, it's easy to do good with Cicero. He's sort of like selling a product that almost sells itself. I will mention the translation is good. I think this is quite readable, and there's some great notes in the back to help out with any of that. If you want to read the Latin, like I said, you've got it there on both sides, which could be a plus for some readers. It's got that nice introduction as well. So, those are all good points about it. And I think it's, they've managed to pick an attractive looking line for this. That's really all I have to say by way of what's good about the work. But like I mentioned, that's in part because I've already given you a lot of the main ideas in here, and you can probably realize, if you're watching this far in, that this is a book that you do want to read, whether in this edition or in some other edition and translation. It wouldn't be a Sadler's honest review if I didn't have this section on what I found problematic about the work, but this is actually going to be rather short because there really isn't much that I find problematic about the book as such. I think it's a great work by Cicero to begin with. It's one that I enjoy reading myself and recommending and teaching, so obviously that's good. So we can talk about the edition. I don't have anything bad to say about the translation. As I mentioned, I think it's quite readable. And I don't, there's nothing when I was going over it where I was like, I wouldn't have translated it that way. That doesn't look right. It's good. So there's nothing on that front. I will say this, and I've mentioned this with the other books in this series as well, that, we already do have the Loeb edition where we have facing Latin and English. And there's, plenty of places where you can get Cicero in Latin online. So I'm not quite sure what the desire is to produce a facing pages text. It would be half the length if it were not facing pages. And, for a book this size, $16.95 is a little bit on the pricey side. I've been told by A.A. Long that he found out that in the European markets, people actually do like having the Latin or Greek on one side and the English on the other. So I have to, there's no reason why I would question his word on that. So obviously, for those who do want that sort of thing, it's kind of a plus. I think that it would make for a smaller volume that would fit more easily into a pocket if it didn't have the Latin. But I suppose it's nice to have it every once in a while. So I really don't have much to say that I think is problematic about this work. All right, final thoughts. I recommend buying this if you don't already have a copy of Cicero's On Friendship. This is a decent one to have, particularly if you do want to be able to study the Latin, but you're not, so invested that you need, the whole critical apparatus that a Loeb provides you with. It is a great work. Even if you're not going to read the Latin and it's kind of superfluous to have it on the other side, I think that it's a good translation and it's quite an attractive cover. So, it's well worth having. And I will say this, that regardless of whether you get this edition and translation or some other one, if you do want to understand your relationships and you want to get some expert advice that largely has stood the test of time for 2 millennia, I think you do want to read Cicero's De Amicitia, or On Friendship, or in this case, How to Be a Friend. It's really a great work, and you shouldn't deprive yourself of the opportunity to think alongside one of the brilliant minds of antiquity who lived a lot, suffered a lot, thought a lot, argued a lot, and brings a lot to the table.